Hello and very warm welcome to the 10th edition of our Experts Dispatch segment. I am Hamraz Sarvani, researcher and assistant editor at the Center for Strategic and Contemporary Research, Islamabad. We are a policy research institute and have been doing these video sessions on a regular basis, in which we conduct brief interviews of policymakers and academicians, both domestic and international, from the research and policy community on various issues of relevance. Today, under the CPEC program initiative, one of the research projects spearheaded by the center, we are here to discuss a recent report published by Carnegie under its China Local Global program titled How China and Pakistan Negotiate. It is authored by Dr. Catherine Adini and Dr. Filippo Boni. The report deliberates upon the question of how much influence does China exert in the development planning in its BRI borrower countries. With the case of Pakistan, the report underscores some very stark and thorough observations, which very much break the myth that China is necessarily looking at BRI as its strategic investment and pushing too much influence into the domestic planning of the borrower countries. Before starting the conversation, I would like to share some of the very salient observations made in the report. The authors note that while the geopolitical implications have been abuzz a lot, a little attention has been given to the actual unfolding of the BRI projects in the borrower countries. The domestic dynamics of those countries and the way they are pushing their choices have been overlooked. The report maintains that instead of imposing CPEC projects on Pakistan, China has been adapting to much of Pakistan's preferences, which need a keen investigation. So while examining this, the report notes that CPEC routes were chosen more because of the partisan politics in Pakistan, in which the lawmakers saw the situatedness of the projects with more relevance to the electoral benefits and less to a flawless development plan. Same is the case with the development of special economic zones, in which the Pakistan Tehreek-e-Insaf government pushed for Rashakai Special Economic Zone, despite the feasibility reports suggesting otherwise. In the same vein, the Gwadar proposal also outdates CPEC by more than a decade. It was put up by Musharraf regime in 2001, and China hasn't necessarily been viewing it as a strategic site for itself. It was not until 2013 that China actually started pouring bulks of its funds into Gwadar. Likewise, energy projects, and especially coal energy, was Pakistan's preference also to do away with its dependence on oil and for electoral ambitions of the incumbent government. Hence, the lofty language used throughout the saga has not been able to live up to the expectations. So these were the prominent observations of the report. Now I would like to move towards starting the conversation, for which we have been fortunate enough to have one of the authors of the report, Dr. Filippo Boni, with us. Dr. Boni is a lecturer in politics and international studies at the Open University in the UK and a research fellow in the European Research Council funded project Redefine. Looking at China's rise and its implications for global development, he's interested in the politics of Chinese investments in South Asia and Europe, as well as in the international relations of South Asia, particularly in bilateral ties between Pakistan and China and the Belt and Road Initiative. He's the author of the book Sino-Pakistan Relations, Politics, Military and Regional Dynamics, published by Routledge in 2019, and his research has also been published in Asian Survey, Commonwealth and Comparative Politics, and Asia Policy, among others. Thank you very much, Dr. Boni, for being with us today. I hope you're doing good.
Thank you very much, Hamraz, for having me, and it's a real pleasure to join you this afternoon or morning, depending on where you are in the world.
Yeah, the pleasure is totally ours, sir. So I would proceed toward our first question, and it's more about the changing quantum of Chinese ambitions over the course of last 2 decades and the incentivization for China in the CPEC projects. All right, Dr. Boni, you mentioned in the report that including Gwadar and energy projects, most of the prioritized projects were Pakistani proposals, the ones on which successive Pakistani governments have been fixated on. While China has not always been as enthusiastic to invest in those projects, but post 2013, we see China's enthusiasm to give in to the Pakistani demands increased. The first part of the question is, do you think other than the internal dynamics of Pakistan, it has also to do with the regime change in China and President Xi Jinping's agenda of a greater Chinese role in the global politics. And the second part of the question is, it has more to do with the incentivization for China. During the PMLN's tenure, China built unprecedented warm relationships with the civilian leadership in Pakistan. The report underscores that this tenure experienced a rigorous Pakistan push for the projects that the government deemed electorally beneficial. While China accepted most of the proposals, but many observations, including one stated in the report, suggest that the negotiations provided Chinese companies with ill-advised tax breaks and irrational dividends. So, in your opinion, is it sane to suppose that it was not only the case of independent development strategies for Pakistan, but also irrational dividends for China that attracted most of the Chinese funds during whole this period?
Thanks very much, Amraz. And also, I mean, let me extend my thanks to the Center for Strategic and Contemporary Research for organizing this conversation and for engaging with our recent report. I'm really delighted to join you virtually for this. So, coming to your questions, I'll start from the first one. I think you're right in saying that the leadership in Beijing and the leadership change in Beijing indeed played an important role in the way in which investments in Pakistan played out. And certainly the decision to kickstart the BRI was a key driver behind this. But what I think our report also emphasizes is that these dynamics occurred in parallel to a new leadership and to a leadership change in Islamabad as well in 2013. And what we observed, especially during that period, is that the PMLN government, in the PLM government, the Chinese found a civilian partner that was willing to push ahead with large-scale infrastructure priorities similar to the ones that China had begun to finance in South Asia and in other parts of the world. So really, the fact that there was political will on both sides, this proved to be quite congenial, especially given that most of the decision-making behind the first phase of CPEC, and certainly also in the ensuing parts, was channeled through a decision-making body such as the Joint Cooperation Committee, which is something we delve into in greater detail in the report. And it was quite a centralized structure, which suited well the PMLN's desire to retain some elements of civilian control, whereas on the other hand was a single point of reference, if you like, for the Chinese side as well, to deal with the beginning of this massive set of investments in Pakistan. So I think the report, what we emphasize with the report is that it was a combination of interest on both sides that paved the way for the development of the corridor, and that Pakistan's agency really mattered in the way in which projects were developed, even as you noted in your introductory remarks. The Belt and Road Initiative, it's really portrayed quite often as something that Beijing parachutes into recipient countries that have very little say in the way in which these dynamics actually unfold on the ground. And what we actually do in our report is to foreground the fact that the complexity of negotiations, the complexity of interest, and the agendas of both sides, and how they played out in the way in which CPEC eventually unfolded on the ground. In terms of your second question about the economic dimension, I think it's also important to note that some of the motivations behind behind Pakistan's decision to embark and to embrace both the BRI and to look at China for funding some of the major infrastructure that was needed at the time was coming from the electricity shortages that was really affecting the country's economy and people's lives. So it wasn't just trying to incentivize China in investing in something that was not beneficial, but it was actually trying to address some of the long-standing issues that the Pakistani economy had back then. So I think this was also one of the important elements that needs to be taken into account when looking at this dynamics.
All right. So building on this very question, you see, after the 2018 elections, troubles have been observed in the steady continuation of the CPEC, along with many reasons, including the Pakistan Tehreek-e-Insaf government's skepticisms, expanded military's role, and the decoupling of the CPEC ambition from the PMLN's Punjab heartland notion. Do you think it has something to do with the geopolitics? Because it was the same time when Pakistan was in a desperate need of bailouts from IMF, Western friends, and Saudi Arabia. So is it possible that the incumbent government shut down or recalibrated most of the projects due to international pressures involving rivalry between China and the US? Do you think, along with the Pakistani domestic agency, these elements and factors were also involved in the changes in the ambitions after 2018 in the CPEC?
For sure, I think this is a very good question, and certainly the geopolitical dimension, although it's not something we look at specifically in our report, certainly played an important role in the way in which these dynamics eventually unfolded. If we look, for instance, at Pakistan was clearly one of the key flashpoints in which the US-China rivalry was very visible. If we remember the remarks made by Ambassador Alice Wells on CPEC in November 2019, and then again in May 2020 about the transparency and job opportunities surrounding the CPEC, that was quite a potent reminder of how important Pakistan was in this dynamics. But I mean, I think in general, I think that I would concur with some of the views expressed in a report for the United States Institute of Peace, which noted that rather than seeing CPEC through a debt trap diplomacy lens, as is what's done most prominently in the US over the past few years, Washington should really recognize that when it comes to Pakistan, there are a lot of interests that it shares with China, most notably in having a stable and economically thriving country. So I think that's one of the elements. Coming to the other two important points you touched on in your question, Saudi Arabia. I think that this was also an interesting thing to look at, especially back when the PTI first came to power and the Prime Minister Imran Khan made his first visit to the Gulf, the first official visit to the Gulf states, rather than China. And I think this was also something that sent some messages about the way in which some of the CPEC projects would unfold. And also discussions with Saudi Arabia about the potential investment in a refinery in Gwadar, which is near the Iranian border, that didn't necessarily take into account or consult with Beijing on this, meant that to an extent the Chinese leadership was also a bit more cautious in dealing with the new government after the elections. So I think, yeah, absolutely, you're right in the sense that the geopolitical dimension is certainly an important lens through which looking at these dynamics. But I think that, again, and going back to the more domestically oriented side of explanations, I think that PTI's agenda, and they've campaigned extensively on anti-corruption, socioeconomic development, and all these themes which paid off quite well electorally. I think that's also an important component, as it was the fact that they wanted really to mark a clear discontinuity between the governance that the PMLN has put in place and that they actually criticize quite heavily. So again, it's an interplay of how domestic agency plays out with the wider regional and international geopolitical dynamics as well.
All right. So also building on this question now, this is a very important question, I think, and I would really like you to deliberate upon this. As the report mentions, the international discourse on the CPEC is mostly occupied with the perspectives of geopolitics and great power struggles and all that. So this is one thing. But on the other hand, one could also argue that ignoring the geopolitics entirely and putting the blame of developmental failures or shortcomings on the borrower developing countries can also be a sort of reproduction of the old Oriental logic that the underdeveloped nations are not fit to plan for themselves, or they cannot be trusted with so much funds independently. So, do you see any currency in this perspective?
No, I mean, I think that the point about the idea behind this report is exactly to challenge this very conception that, you know, the China-Pakistan economic corridor is something where Pakistan had no say in it, and it was actually another, you know, project where the recipient country was simply absorbing and taking on board stuff that they didn't not really want, or they didn't have the capacity to respond to. What we see here is that really it's important to emphasize how the decision making worked through shared structures with the Chinese side, and how the inputs and some of the priorities that Pakistan was able to identify were taken on board in this massive infrastructure investment. So there is a way in which BRI recipient countries can shape how projects unfold on the ground for their own benefits. As in all contexts, there are things that go a bit better, things that work less, but I don't think it's a matter of looking at it from an Orientalist perspective. I think it's a matter of trying to identify, as I was saying at the beginning of our conversation, the complexity and the way in which the agendas of different players work on the ground and play out in this type of situation. So I think that's really important. And I mean, highlighting some of the shortcomings doesn't mean that, I mean, in most development projects, you find these types of difficulties. So some of the recommendations as well that we make is to try and increase transparency, to try and sort of provide also opportunities that actually materialize for the local population. So I think this is something which in the long term we will hopefully see. But what we were hoping to do with this report was to flip this view of an Orientalist perspective, where the major power in an asymmetric relationship goes to any sort of context and imposes its own will and projects. It's not as simple or as straightforward as some of these of the early studies of the BRI would sort of suggest.
All right. So my next question is regarding the developmental asymmetries. As the report mentions, Gawade sort of depicts a very different picture compared to the development of special economic zones in other parts of the country. This one project has received more focus and continued investments from both the Pakistani and Chinese sides. And the report also mentions that after the Chinese Overseas Port Holding Company took over the management of Gawade, the project is to run more like the Hong Kong model. The Chinese companies are to reap 91% of the profits, plus Chinese fishermen are to take the catch home duty free. And that is at the expense of the livelihoods of the local fishermen. So the Hong Kong model regarding that, firstly, I would like to ask you, is it plausible to say that it is the unreasonable incentivization that has attracted China to accept most of the proposals, especially in the case of Gawade, because there's a lot of enthusiasm there? And secondly, can the asymmetry between the Hong Kong and China also replicate in the case of Gawade?
These are very good questions. Thanks, Amraz. I think it's important to consider that some of the prioritized projects in Gwadar, including the East Bay Expressway, were aimed to address some of Beijing's concerns about the lack of connectivity around the port and its geographic isolation from Pakistan's transport networks. So there was clearly a need to try and attract, in a way, Chinese investments in an area that, at least in principle, and when the first And when the first sort of discussions around Gwadar started with the Musharraf government in the early 2000s, didn't look particularly viable from an economic standpoint. So I don't think it's a surprise that a lot of these concerns were then some of the ones that were addressed head on in the early Joint Cooperation Committee meetings that we've analyzed in the report. And very much the East Bay Expressway was a way to try and link Gwadar to the wider highways and infrastructure network of the other parts of Pakistan. So it was clear that Beijing was not willing to accept anything that lacked any underlying commercial or logistical logic. So I think that in terms of incentives, there was a need to incentivize, and I think that in terms of the idea of the trickle-down effects that these projects might have also on the local population, you mentioned there the fishermen, and this is something that is also discussed in the report. One of the recommendations that we make with this, in our recent work, is that recipient countries need to build in mechanisms to ensure that technology and training, technology transfers and training are a key component of the BRI development projects. We've seen that many of the sort of projects that were supposed to win hearts and minds and to sort of have an impact on local populations, some of them have been developed, some of them, though, have been either postponed or removed. So I think that's an area where more work needs to be done as far as CPEC is concerned. And I think this is something which it's very important and relates to the wider opportunities that CPEC could sort of bring about.
All right. So in connection to this, winning the hearts and minds and the technology transfer matters and stuff like this, you see, as Pakistan pledges to provide the Chinese investors with complete and secured property rights protection in the country. So, but in Pakistan, there are very dated and repressive land acquisition mechanisms in place. The land acquisition for mega developmental projects in Pakistan have mostly been throughout the history very coercive toward the local communities. So firstly, given this, how much fruitful the development of special economic zones and infrastructure projects could be for the local communities, or how much would the fruits of independent development strategies trickle down to the bottom of the society? And secondly, one of the many problems regarding the employment outlook of the CPEC is the unavailability of the high-tech local labor, the problem you referred to. So this is a void which must be filled with the Chinese labor. So how much do you think the CPEC has been successful to build high-tech capacities in local labor and transfer technology in the real terms in the real meaning of the term?
Thanks. That's another very good question, and I think in terms of job, it's difficult to come up with a picture which is clear and particularly accurate. So in terms of jobs, what we've seen is that, I mean, in January 2020, the Faisalabad Industrial Development and Management Company claimed that the special economic zone would absorb 400,000 skilled workers in 4 years. Last week, we've seen the inauguration of the Rashakai Special Economic Zone, and it was reported that it would create at least 200,000 job opportunities. And back in 2018, the government-funded CPEC Center for Excellence estimated that 1.2 million jobs would be created as part of CPEC by 2030. So these are important claims that signify that there is an attention on this particular aspect of CPEC, though it's very difficult to independently verify how much of this has actually materialized. So what we do in the report is that we, through some of the interviews that we've conducted, we've tried to triangulate these claims with how things are actually unfolding. And a shared perspective, a shared view was that locals would be normally in lower positions and that they would suffer some salary discrepancies. At the same time that China has often reported that they can't really find high-tech or specialized labor in Pakistan. So whenever they cannot find this medium to high skilled labor, they bring in the Chinese workers. Some of our interviewees also noted that with time, these dynamics might change. So it's not something that it's what it is today. It's likely to be the same in 20 years, 10 years down the line. But still, I think a picture which we need to find a sort of halfway through between the big claims that are made and some of the actual realities on the ground. And I think this goes also back to one of the points that we emphasize is that the rhetoric and the reality at times not always, they don't always match, because there have been made big announcements again about jobs, about the amount of total investments, whereas what you see on the ground, it's something which is very significant, but still it doesn't quite add up to what it's to how it's been presented and portrayed. So also a careful framing of some of these issues would manage expectations as well around how some projects unfold. So, and I think here again, the point is to emphasize the importance that vocational training institutes and technology transfers and all these dynamics play as potentially benefiting the country beyond, you know, the industrial and macroeconomic picture.
Very well, sir. I think that would be all with the questions from my side. And I must say, Dr. Boni, it was a very interesting and very enriching discussion with you. And first, the report you authored was very interesting, and now this conversation. So I would really thank you for the valuable time that you have given us. And yeah.
And thank you so much to you, Hamraz, again, and to the Center for Strategic and Contemporary Research for the opportunity to highlight some of the main points that we touch on in the report. And the report is freely available to download from Carnegie's website. So I think it would be interesting to hear thoughts and feedback on this as well. So thanks again for this important conversation that we had today.